A man staggered out of Hoover Dam's diversion tunnel with his face blackened by dust and exhaust. He tried to breathe, coughed once, and dropped, still wearing his hard hat, still gripping his drill steel. Inside that tunnel, the air could kill without water, bullets, or collapse. The dam's legend is concrete and speeches, but why was its real foundation laid in a gas-filled furnace underground? I'm James. Before anyone poured the first proud wall of concrete, the Colorado River had to be shoved aside. That's what the diversion tunnels were for, miles of blasted rock cut through Black Canyon so the river could be rerouted and the riverbed could be exposed. On paper, it's engineering. In real life, it was a job where the clock mattered more than comfort, and the work environment was a sealed tube full of heat, dust, and fumes. Dawn at the canyon rim felt deceptively clean. A pale sun, cold coffee, men tightening boots and joking the way men joke when they're about to do something they don't want to think about. Then the shift boss read names and pointed toward the tunnel mouth like it was a mine entrance to another planet. The first steps inside were always the same. Light died quickly. Sound multiplied. Compressors thumping, engines growling, steel on stone, voices turned into shouts because the tunnel swallowed quiet. The air got heavy, then wet, then hot. Not desert hot, machine hot, breath hot. Hot enough that sweat appeared under a hard hat in minutes and never dried. A drill crew worked the face, where the tunnel advanced inch by inch. Pete Alvarez drove the jackhammer into rock until his arms went numb. Eddie Collins held hoses and tried not to think about the dust that floated like fog and stuck to teeth. Somewhere behind them, a truck idled too long, and the exhaust had nowhere to go except into their lungs. You could taste the air in there. It tasted like oil and crushed stone. After an hour, every man's spit looked darker. After 2, you stopped spitting because your mouth was too dry to make saliva. The routine was brutal and simple. Drill holes, pack charges, clear back, blast, then rush in to muck the broken rock out before the next cycle. Each blast made the tunnel shudder like it was alive. Dust surged forward in a rolling wall. Men pulled rags over their mouths, not because rags worked, but because doing something felt better than doing nothing. One morning the blast went clean. No collapse, no obvious failure. The crew went back in fast, too fast, because the schedule was already bleeding minutes. Miguel Santos, a mucking hand, pushed a cart along the slick floor where water and rock slurry mixed into a paste. He was coughing, not the dry cough of a cold, but the deep, irritated cough of dust that had found a home. He wiped his mouth with the back of his glove and left a black smear on his skin. That's what the men started calling it when it showed up everywhere. Black cough. Not poetry. A warning. Miguel's cough hit again. Harder. He stopped, bent forward, and tried to drag air into his chest. He couldn't. His knees softened like someone had cut his strings. The cart kept rolling a foot and tapped his boot. He went down on one hand, then on both, gasping with his face an inch above the muck. "Get him out," someone shouted. 2 men grabbed Miguel under the arms and hauled him backward toward fresher air, boots slipping, bodies straining. He wasn't dramatic about it. That was the horror. He looked confused, like his body had broken a rule without telling him. His eyes were wide and wet. He tried to speak and only wheezed. They dragged him past an idling engine, past a puddle of slurry, past a coil of cable that could snag an ankle and turn a stumble into a fall. When they finally reached a pocket where air moved a little better, Miguel coughed once and brought up something dark. He shook his head like he didn't recognize his own spit. The foreman didn't kneel. He looked at his watch. "How long are we down?" he asked. 5 minutes, a timekeeper answered. "Then we're not down," the foreman said. "Swap him out, back to the face." Miguel was sent toward the tunnel mouth with a medic who had more authority than supplies. Another man stepped into Miguel's spot without ceremony, because in the Depression-era West, a job was a lifeline, and lifelines came with strings. Later that same shift, the tunnel collected a cleaner death. A truck backed into the muck lane to take a load of broken rock. The driver couldn't see well. The tunnel lights were weak and the dust ate contrast. A rigger waved him in, arm motions sharp, but the rigger's boot slipped on the wet floor. His hand signal turned into a flail. The truck kept coming. It didn't crush him all at once. It pinned him against the rock wall with a slow, awful pressure that made men shout his name as if names could stop steel. When they finally pulled the truck forward, he slid down the wall and left a smear in the dust that looked like paint. The medic checked him. The foreman scanned the tunnel behind them. "Clear the lane," he ordered. "We can't block the hall." The body went out on a makeshift stretcher. The cart track got rinsed with buckets. The engine started again. In the record book, the death would be reduced to a line: accident struck, deceased. The tunnel didn't care how it was phrased. The tunnel only cared that the next blast was on time, and that's the real dark history of Hoover Dam. Before the parades and the concrete and the river tamed, men went into a furnace of stone and exhaust to move water out of the way, and the project trained everyone to treat the air as normal, right up until it wasn't. Subscribe and hit like, because next you'll hear what the tunnels did to the men who survived them, and how the paperwork learned to call it anything but the tunnel. By the second month, the tunnel stopped feeling like a place you entered, and started feeling like something you wore. Men came out coated in a grey-black film that didn't wash off with one rinse. It lived in the creases of knuckles, in the corners of eyes, in the throat. They'd step into daylight squinting like moles, spit once, and the spit would land dark as engine oil. Some laughed about it, until the laugh turned into a cough that wouldn't let go. Let me explain what was happening in plain terms. A diversion tunnel is a sealed tube where every bad thing multiplies. Heat has nowhere to escape, dust has nowhere to settle, and exhaust has nowhere to go. Add blasting. Fresh rock turned to powder. Then add trucks and compressors burning fuel inside a confined space. You don't need a cave-in for men to drop. You just need enough minutes breathing the wrong air. They tried to fix it with habits first, because habits are cheaper than equipment. Rags over mouths, wet shirts, men soaking bandanas and tying them tight until the cloth stuck to lips. A water barrel by the entrance that got warm by noon, then warmer, then useless. Guys learning to take shallow breaths like they were stealing air instead of earning it. The old hands would tap the new ones on the shoulder and say, "Don't try to be a hero. The tunnel doesn't notice heroes." Pete Alvarez started carrying two things every shift: drill steel and a lump of hard candy. The candy wasn't for taste. It was to trick his mouth into making spit so the dust didn't feel like sandpaper against his tongue. When the drill bit screamed into rock, his shoulders shook with the vibration. When the blast went off, his teeth rattled. When the mucking began, he could taste grit between every breath. Miguel Santos came back after his collapse, not because he'd recovered, because if you disappeared from the roster, you disappeared from pay. He had the black cough now, deep, rasping like something sticky tearing loose. He'd turn his head and cough into his sleeve, then look down at the stain like it offended him. The foreman called it a cold out loud. Privately, the men called it what it felt like. The tunnel taking a souvenir. The blast cycle got faster. Drill holes, pack charges, clear back, detonate. Rush in before the dust fully settles because time is bleeding and the river doesn't care about your lungs. One shift, the crew went back in too soon. They knew it the second the air hit their faces, thick, hot, with a sharp bite that made eyes water instantly. Eddie Collins took 3 steps and stopped, blinking hard. His stomach lurched the way it does when your body realizes it's being poisoned. "Fan's not pulling," someone shouted. The ventilation hose was hanging, but the airflow felt like a joke. The engines were still idling. The dust was still in the beam of their headlamps, suspended like a dirty fog. Eddie tried to swallow and gagged instead. Miguel took a knee. Pete grabbed his arm. "Don't sit," Pete snapped. "If you sit, you stay." Miguel tried to stand and couldn't. His face went slack, eyes unfocused. He was still conscious, but he looked like a man stepping out of his own body. Pete and Eddie hauled him backward toward the entrance, while Miguel's boots dragged furrows through the muck. Behind them, the foreman's voice chased like a whip. "Keep the lane clear, don't block the hall." That line mattered more than Miguel's breathing. Outside, Miguel vomited black-streaked spit into the gravel and shook like he was freezing, even though the sun was a hammer. The medic checked his pupils, listened to his chest, then glanced toward the tunnel like a man watching a fire he couldn't put out. "Sit in shade," the medic said. "Water. Slow." Miguel looked up, desperate. "I can't go back in." The foreman heard him and answered without raising his voice. "Then you don't go on payroll." Miguel stared at him. The foreman stared back. Around them, trucks kept rolling, because the river schedule didn't negotiate with fear. Miguel went back in the next day. That's how it worked. The tunnel didn't just injure bodies, it cornered choices. The ordinary deaths kept coming, and they were always the same kind of ordinary. Fast, unglamorous, easy to reduce to a line. A man tripped over an air hose in the half-light and fell under a moving cart. The cart didn't crush him like a movie. It pinned his leg, snapped it, and the panic made him twist in the worst possible way. By the time they got the load off him, his face was grey and his breath was wrong. He died later, not under rock but on a cot with his mouth open as if he still couldn't pull enough air. A worker climbed onto a truck bed to free a stuck chain. The chain released suddenly, whipped, and caught him across the neck. He went down hard, fingers clawing at his throat, boots scraping uselessly on stone dust. Someone tried to talk him through breathing. Someone else ran for the medic. The foreman shouted for the next load to keep moving around them, and then there were the blasts. Most of the time, blasting was controlled violence, measured holes, measured charges, measured distance, but tunnels have a way of punishing even disciplined men. A misfire meant waiting in heat and fumes while everyone pretended they weren't afraid to re-enter. A premature detonation meant rock and dust moving faster than reflex. One afternoon, a charge went early. The boom hit like a punch. The air pressure slapped faces. Lights flickered. Dust surged down the tunnel in a rolling wall so thick it turned headlamps into halos. Men stumbled backward, hands out, coughing instantly. Someone yelled a name, then screamed again. When they found him, he was on the floor with his hard hat split and his hands still curled around a tool like he'd been trying to hold on to work as the world broke. They dragged him out on a board. His chest moved twice, shallow, then didn't move again. Above ground, the sun looked bright and stupid. Men stood around the body in silence that lasted only as long as it took to clear the lane. A timekeeper wrote something down. A supervisor spoke quietly to the medic. The foreman turned back toward the tunnel mouth as if looking at it could restart the day. And then the next crew walked in, because every hour the river wasn't diverted was an hour the entire dam couldn't exist. That was the math men lived under. The project didn't merely want their labour, it wanted their lungs, their heat tolerance, their willingness to treat air that hurts as normal. By the end of the month, the black cough wasn't a symptom. It was a uniform. And the worst part wasn't that men were dying inside the tunnels. It was that men were dying outside them too, later, quieter, after the shift ended, after the paperwork stopped caring what the tunnel had done. The worst thing the tunnels did wasn't always immediate. Sometimes the tunnel waited. A man could finish a shift, climb out into sunlight, wash his face in a barrel, laugh at a joke that wasn't funny, and then wake up at midnight choking like his own lungs had turned against him. The next morning he'd be carried to the clinic with his skin hot and his breath shallow, and by the afternoon he'd be off roster. That's where the story turns. Not from danger to safety, there was no safety. From suffering to accounting. I'm James. If you want to understand how projects like this stay clean in the public memory, don't look for a secret meeting. Look for categories. Look for the way a death inside a tunnel becomes a word on paper that sounds like weather. The medical shack near the tunnel mouth never smelled like medicine. It smelled like sweat, dust, and disinfectant trying to lose a fight. Men sat on benches with their shirts open, chests heaving, faces grey. A nurse moved down the line with a clipboard, writing fast, not because she didn't care, because the line never ended. Miguel Santos was there again, 2 days after the premature blast. He hadn't been hit by rock. He hadn't been crushed. He'd just breathed too much of the wrong air for too long. He coughed into a rag and unfolded it like he was checking a map. The stain was dark. He looked up at the medic, eyes pleading. "It's getting worse," Miguel rasped. The medic listened to his chest, face tight. "You need rest," Miguel gave a bitter half-laugh. "Rest don't pay." The medic glanced toward the office trailer where payroll and incident reports lived. He didn't say what everyone knew. If Miguel disappeared from the tunnel crews, another man would be in his place before the rag dried. A timekeeper came in, not a villain, just a cog with a pencil behind his ear. He asked the medic, "He back tomorrow?" The medic hesitated. "He shouldn't be." The timekeeper nodded as if that was interesting, then wrote something anyway. He didn't write poisoned by exhaust. He didn't write dust-filled air. He wrote a softer phrase that could cover anything. Illness. Miguel sat there and listened to his life being turned into a category. Outside, the foreman talked about minutes. The tunnel had a rhythm that couldn't be broken without consequences. Drill, blast, muck, haul. If the mucking slowed, trucks stacked up. If trucks stacked up, the tunnel face couldn't be cleared. If the face wasn't cleared, the blast cycle slipped. And if the blast cycle slipped, the river schedule slipped. And the river schedule was the spine of the entire project. So the job learned to root around anything human. A man collapses, drag him out, swap him, keep the lane clear. A man can't breathe. Shade, water, you'll be fine, then back in. A man dies later in a cot. That's not a tunnel death. That's a medical problem. That's paperwork. Pete Alvarez saw it happen to Eddie Collins. Eddie had been a hose man, always cursing, always moving, the kind of worker who never sat down because sitting down made you think. After weeks of breathing dust and exhaust, Eddie's cough got wet. He started losing weight. He'd lean against a truck tire between cycles and stare at nothing like his mind was somewhere else. One night he didn't come to roll call. The next morning Pete saw two men carrying Eddie out of a bunkhouse, feet dragging, head lolling. Eddie's skin had that waxy look that made the tough guys go quiet. His breathing sounded like it was coming through water. They took him to the clinic, then they took him away from the site. By noon, Eddie's name was scratched off the crew sheet and replaced with another. Nobody said the tunnel did that. Out loud, the words were safer: pneumonia, heat, weak lungs, anything that made it sound like Eddie's body had failed on its own, like the tunnel was just the place he happened to be. Pete went to the office trailer once not to complain, he wasn't stupid, but because he needed to see if Eddie's name meant anything on paper. Through a half-open door he saw a clerk flipping forms, stamping dates, turning people into lines. The clerk's hands were clean. That wasn't an insult. It was a detail that stayed in Pete's head because it felt wrong next to the black dust still under his nails. A supervisor spoke to the clerk in a low voice. Pete caught fragments. Family notified, no statement, put it as illness, keep it tight, not a plot, a process. That afternoon, a reporter tried to talk to men near the gate. The guard turned him away. The reporter waited anyway, notebook ready, hoping someone would break. No one did. Not because they loved the company, because they'd seen what happened to men who became problems. Safety talk didn't get you medals. It got you replaced. Inside the tunnel, the day carried on with the same dirty momentum. Another cart took a corner too fast on slick muck and clipped a man's hip, sending him into the wall. He slid down, clutching his side, face twisted in pain. He didn't die right there. He worked the rest of the week hunched over, then vanished into the clinic and never came back. A cable snapped under load and whipped a worker across the forearm, opening him up like meat. He screamed once, then bit down on his own sleeve to stop screaming again. They wrapped it, sent him to medical, and the next crew stepped into place. The tunnel didn't need spectacular disaster. The tunnel was a daily grinder, and the paperwork learned a vocabulary that could swallow anything: incident, accident, illness, heat, injury, separated. Words that sounded clean enough to sit in a report without making anyone flinch. By the end of the season, the black cough wasn't just a symptom. It was a warning men carried home. Wives heard it at night in the dark. Kids heard it through thin walls. Men would cough into a rag, look at the stain, then fold the rag and go back to work anyway. Because the dam wasn't only building a wall, it was building a rule. The project comes first, and everything else is a footnote. And the tunnels were where that rule became real. The night the tunnel finally killed a man the right way, the foreman called it bad luck. It was the kind of chain that looks obvious afterward and invisible before it happens. A long shift, heat that never leaves the rock, a ventilation line that's working just well enough to justify staying inside, engines idling because the haul can't stop, and men so tired they start moving on instinct instead of judgment. The blast had gone off clean, no collapse, no obvious failure. The crew was sent back in fast because the schedule was already behind and nobody wanted to be the one who admitted they were afraid of air. They were mucking hard, clearing broken rock into trucks as if speed could erase the stinging in their throats. Pete Alvarez was at the face, sweating through his shirt, dust stuck to his eyebrows. Miguel Santos, back again, because the job never cared about yesterday, was pushing a cart with his head down, trying to save breath. Then the engine smell changed. It got sharper, heavier, the kind of change your body notices before your brain names it. One of the ventilation hoses had slipped loose from its brace and sagged lower, stealing airflow from the face and dumping it into a pocket behind them. The pocket didn't look like anything. That was the problem. Gas doesn't announce itself in a tunnel. It just quietly replaces what you need. Miguel stopped pushing. He lifted his head like he was listening for a sound nobody else could hear. His eyes widened. His mouth opened and he tried to inhale. Nothing came in the right way. He took 2 steps, then folded forward onto his knees, hands on the muck as if he could steady himself against the ground. His shoulders hitched. His lips went pale. He looked up at Pete with panic that wasn't dramatic, just pure animal confusion. Pete grabbed him. "Get up," he barked, not angry, terrified. "Get up," Miguel tried. His arms shook. He couldn't make his legs answer. Eddie Collins had looked like that right before he disappeared from the roster. A man behind them shouted, "Air's bad!" Now the tunnel reacted, and the reaction was chaos with rules. The foreman didn't yell, "Evacuate." He yelled, "Clear the lane," because the lane was the only path out, and panic in the lane meant bodies piled where nobody could drag them. Men started stumbling backward, coughing, hands out, boots slipping in muck. Headlamps bobbed like fireflies. Somebody dropped a tool and didn't stop to pick it up. Somebody else tried to run, slipped, and went down hard, elbows and knees scraping rock. The worst part was how quiet it could get in the middle of that noise. Men too winded to shout, too poisoned to think, only the engine growl and the rasp of lungs trying to work. Pete got Miguel under the arms and pulled. Miguel's boots dragged trenches. Miguel's head lolled once, then snapped up again as if he was fighting to stay inside his own body. Halfway back, a truck idled in the narrow lane, waiting for the signal to move. The driver saw the crowd and froze. Pete screamed at him to back out. The driver tried, but the truck lurched wrong on slick muck and stalled for a heartbeat. One heartbeat too long. That stall turned the lane into a choke point. Bodies pressed. Someone screamed. Someone fell. The air got worse because now more engines were idling, more exhaust filling the same narrow tube. Pete dragged Miguel sideways around the truck's rear, scraping his own shoulder on rock. Miguel's hands clawed at Pete's sleeve like a child clinging to a parent in surf. They reached a slightly fresher pocket near the entrance where the air moved, just barely. Miguel coughed once. It wasn't a normal cough. It was a short convulsion that ended in a wet gasp, and then his chest stopped trying. Pete slapped his face. "Hey! Hey!" Miguel's eyes were open but empty, like he'd been pulled out through his own pupils. The medic arrived breathless, knelt, tried to force air back into a body that had already been denied it too long. He worked hard, real effort, real urgency, but the tunnel had already decided. The foreman stared at his watch anyway, because some instincts on this job were stronger than grief. When the medic finally shook his head, the foreman's face tightened, not into sorrow but into calculation. "Get him out," he said, "and nobody blocks the mouth. We still have cycle." I'm going to stop you right there, because this is the ugliest truth about a project built on deadlines. The moment a death becomes undeniable, the system doesn't suddenly become humane. It becomes efficient. It tries to keep the death from becoming a stoppage that spreads. Miguel was carried out into daylight on a board. His boots bumped against rocks on the way, and that sound, small, careless, felt like the final insult. Men stood in the sun, coughing black into rags, watching a friend become a removal problem. Then the day kept going. Inside the office trailer, paperwork started moving faster than sympathy. A form, a stamp, a category that made the death look like an isolated incident instead of the predictable end of poisoned air. And then, weeks later, the victory arrived. The diversion tunnels were ready. The river was guided into them like a conquered thing, water roaring into the darkness, the project's first great public proof that progress was winning. Men cheered because they needed to believe the suffering had meant something. Supervisors smiled for visitors. Cameras found angles that looked heroic. Water redirected, nature tamed, America building in a hard era. But the truth was that something else had been diverted first. Responsibility. The worst of the project happened where no one wanted to look, inside a furnace of rock and exhaust, so the myth could live outside in clean sunlight. The public would remember concrete and ceremony. The tunnel crews would remember coughing until they saw stars, staggering out with their faces black, and watching names vanish into words like illness and incident. And if you ever wonder why monuments stay shiny in history, it's because the darkest work is done in places the story can ignore. If you want to be part of one community that refuses to ignore it, subscribe so we stay together here. Hit like if you think the cost matters, and comment this. When a project demands men breathe poison to stay on schedule, do you call the result progress, or just success at any price?